A firmware update has improved the HDR picture accuracy on the Samsung S95B QD-OLED so much that I think that it's one of the best TVs you can buy in terms of picture quality in 2022. Let me explain. After installing firmware update 12.11, the Samsung S95B QD-OLED now tracks the ST2084 PQ standard accurately on different window sizes smaller than 10% in HDR Filmmaker Mode, contributing to more faithful reproduction of the creative intent. Furthermore, the firmware update has added 20-point white balance controls to Filmmaker Mode. This is important because like all Samsung TVs, the S95B stays on the same picture preset when you switch from HDR to SDR and vice versa. Now, as far as we are concerned, Filmmaker Mode is the only accurate picture preset on the Samsung S95B for watching HDR movies, since there is undefeatable dynamic tone mapping in the Cal Day, Cal Night and movie modes, causing the HDR presentation to look too bright. The addition of 20-point white balance controls means that once you switch from HDR to SDR, the SDR Filmmaker Mode on the Samsung S95B QD-OLED can now be calibrated with increased precision to achieve more accurate grayscale and colors. On our 55-inch retail unit, we obtain an average delta error of slightly above 1, with no inaccuracy exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3, resulting in accurate and cinematic colors in real-world SDR content. QD-OLED technology doesn't involve the use of white subpixels, so the Samsung S95B didn't manifest near-black chrominance overshoot which affects WRGB OLEDs. However, when displaying this near-black overdrive test pattern developed by Stacy Spears of Spears and Mansell fame, it turned out that the S95B exhibited more undershoot than overshoot artifacts, in that when switching from certain dark tones to even darker ones, the pixel response was too slow, resulting in a slightly different kind of reverse flashing, as well as some smearing or trailing artifacts when the pattern starts panning around. To make it absolutely clear, the black smearing on the Samsung S95B was nowhere nearly as noticeable or bothersome as the chrominance overshoot artifacts on WRGB OLED televisions in real-world content, since it was so rare and fleeting that we couldn't even film it to show you. But if you are seeing some trailing artifacts when you pan around in very dark games, this luminous undershoot is the reason, and maybe that's why Samsung decided to over-brighten its HDR game mode so much. More on this later. In my opinion, the biggest strengths of the Samsung S95B QD-OLED are its screen uniformity and viewing angles, outperforming any WRGB OLED TV I've reviewed to date in these two key areas. And the crucial thing to remember is that these benefits can be enjoyed across all types of content, regardless of whether it's SDR or HDR, regardless of whether it's movies, sports, or games. Early on, there were some swirly blotches on our Samsung S95B retail unit when displaying low-gray slides, but they cleared up after several compensation cycles, and eventually dark uniformity was cleaner than any WRGB OLED I've tested so far. Bright uniformity was also excellent, with no banding, dirty screen effect or color tinting at all on full-field gray slides, not even from an angle, unlike recent deuterium-based WRGB OLED panels which manifest an obvious pink tint off axis. Next, motion. Even with all motion settings disabled in the picture menu, the Samsung S95B correctly performed 5.5 pull-down to present slow panning shots in 24p films accurately without telecinic judder. However, just like most Samsung TVs we've reviewed over the years, the 24p motion processing seemed to work on a scene-by-scene basis, applying interpolation for one frame before switching it off for the remainder of the scene, causing a visible stutter immediately after certain scene cuts, for example in our own custom-authored interpolation detection test pattern. Don't worry, we only saw this 24p motion hiccup very rarely when watching real-world content, but the easiest way to reproduce it is by pausing your displayer and then resuming playback after a while. You should see a small stutter once the movie starts playing. Due to OLED's near-instantaneous pixel response time, the mild stutter inherent in 24p material would be more obvious than on an LED LCD whose increased motion blur would ironically mask the 24p stutter. If you are sensitive to this issue, You can set the judder reduction control to a low value to smooth out the stutter without incurring too much soap opera effect or SOE. Although Samsung's interpolation generally manifested a bit more artifacts than LG's cinematic movement and Sony's motion flow implementations. Because Samsung's clear motion black frame insertion or BFI operates at 60Hz, it would inevitably introduce telecinic judder in 24 frames per second movies. For 25 and 50 frames per second content we normally get in PAL regions, the South Korean manufacturer has implemented undefeatable motion smoothing when BFI is engaged to prevent frame rate conversion judder. But this does mean that you'll see soap opera effect in 25p films, not to mention various interpolation artifacts in 50Hz content. And when you consider that engaging clear motion would incur some flicker and dim the picture on screen, even halving peak brightness in HDR with a corresponding darkening of the PQ EOTF tracking, we think most people should just keep clear motion disabled for the most pleasant viewing experience. Otherwise, Samsung's motion-compensated frame interpolation could improve motion resolution from the sample and hold baseline of 300 lines to 650 lines on this horizontally scrolling test pattern, but would also introduce some microstutter in 50Hz content from time to time, especially during hand gestures immediately following a scene cut. The Samsung S95B QD-OLED didn't handle low bitrate material as well as other high-end OLEDs from A brands for several reasons. 1. There's no dedicated decontouring filter on the television, so in-content posterization in heavily compressed material would be fully exposed without mitigation. Even engaging the noise reduction control under the picture clarity submenu didn't smooth out the posterization to any noticeable degree. 2. The upscaling on the Samsung S95B was fairly aggressive with some overshoot and fizziness. While this resulted in a perceptibly sharper picture, especially with what appeared to be a minor dose of dynamic sharpening at all times even with sharpness set to 0, MPEG compression noise were also amplified, causing bit-starved content to look harsher than expected. Circling back to the SMPTE RP133 test cards shown earlier, note that just like on all Samsung TVs we've tested, overscan cannot be disabled in standard definition resolution on the S95B, leading to a more zoomed-in and slightly softer standard def presentation. High-definition broadcast and 1080p Blu-rays look impressively sharp, which is helped in part by QD-OLED's insanely high contrast, although the aforementioned dynamic sharpening could cause some high bitrate scenes with plenty of fine detail to appear a touch over-sharpened and artificial. Following firmware update 12.11, peak brightness on our 55-inch Samsung S95B QD-OLED retail unit measured above 1000 nits on a 10% or smaller window, and slightly more than 200 nits full screen. The S95B featured the most relaxed ABL or automatic brightness limiter circuitry among any OLED TV we have reviewed to date, which, together with QD-OLED's high color luminance that's not diluted by the presence of white subpixels, contributed to the most impactful HDR we've witnessed from a consumer OLED TV so far. As you can deduce from the EOTF tracking, shadow detail will be presented in a slightly darker manner, not to the level of being obviously crushed, just darker than reference. Increasing the shadow detail setting beyond the default value of 0 unfortunately would also lead to floating blacks, including in the top and bottom letterbox bars, and so wasn't a viable solution for us. Given that most OLED manufacturers struggle with coming out of black accurately, it's not a big problem at all, but we hope that a future update to the Kalman calibration software can allow for AutoCal in Filmmaker Mode to improve near-black luminance accuracy. Talking about calibration, I would like to tell you about the pre-calibration service offered by UK electrical retailer Compton More, who have kindly sponsored this video. I have personally trained their calibrator David Corner to my very own high standards. For an extra fee, he will run in a television you buy from them, calibrate it and deliver it to you after having the calibration approved by me. We've been doing this for more than 11 months, and customer feedback has been excellent. So please give Compton More a call if you wish to buy a pre-calibrated television that accurately reproduces the creative intent, or even any new TV at a competitive price with excellent customer service. Thanks again for your support. Okay, unlike most other OLED manufacturers which tone map according to max CL metadata, Samsung televisions, including the S95B QD-OLED, adapt their HDR10 tone curve to MDL or mastering display luminance metadata. While this approach could retain all specular highlight detail even in 4000 nit content, some titles which have been graded conservatively but put in a 4000 nit container, such as Tenet, would occasionally come across dimmer than reference depending on the scene APL. Native 10-bit gradation was very good on the Samsung S95B, with no significant posterization in the skies of the Martian, so the lack of a smooth gradation decontouring filter isn't a problem at all when watching 4K Blu-rays. However, the color space auto setting doesn't actually auto-switch, and will always adopt the color gamut value under the color space custom submenu. If left at its default setting of DCI-P3, there would be undesirable posterization in certain tones in 4K Blu-rays mastered to Rec 2020 primaries, requiring users to manually switch to BT 2020 to not only eradicate the posterization, but also obtain accurate colors. The thing is, it's not easy for consumers to find out which titles are mastered to DCI-P3 and which to Rec 2020, so we hope Samsung can fix the color space auto-switching, bringing the S95B in line with other OLED TVs from LG, Panasonic and Sony in this respect. For playing games, the Samsung S95B QD-OLED is undoubtedly one of the best you can buy on the market today. With game mode engaged, input lag on a 60 frames per second video signal measured 9.2 milliseconds on the fastest setting, down from 13 milliseconds on the faster setting, indicating that Samsung is also using a frame doubling to 120Hz technique similar to the boost mode on LG OLED televisions. The input lag fast setting measured slightly slower at 19 milliseconds, which is necessary for Game Motion Plus to be enabled. While we appreciate the possibility of deploying motion interpolation to smooth out the stutter in 30 FPS games while maintaining fairly low input lag, note that Game Motion Plus is grayed out and unavailable with a 120Hz video signal, which is how we envision most next-gen console and PC gamers would prefer to play at 4K 120Hz, particularly with VRR. In fact, we found the Samsung S95B to be able to unofficially support a 4K 144Hz video signal from a high-end PC, such as one with an NVIDIA RTX 3090 graphics card. 4 HDMI 2.1 ports are provided on the S95B, all supporting the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, as well as 24 gigabits per second of DSC or display stream compression. The TV's superb native 10-bit gradation carried over to game mode too, resulting in less posterization than what you would typically see on LG OLEDs. VR implementation, including G-Sync, was buttery smooth without noticeable tearing or frame drops in the NVIDIA Pendulum app. But since the S95B is still an OLED TV at the end of the day, some VRR flicker was inevitable in some sedate scenes and static menus. Even though engaging the game HDR setting under the HDR tone mapping submenu is meant to activate HGIG, unfortunately we discovered that dynamic tone mapping was still active at all times in HDR game mode on the Samsung S95B, leading users to chase after unrealistically high maximum tone map luminance and maximum full frame tone map luminance values in the HDR calibration screens on the Sony PS5 and the Xbox Series X, which will cause HGIG compliant games to look overly washed out with severe clipping of bright highlight detail. As a workaround, we recommend setting maximum tone map luminance and maximum full frame tone map luminance to 1000 nits for the Samsung S95B to preserve specular highlights, then letting the TV's dynamic tone mapping take over in HDR game mode. Please bear in mind that the EOTF or electro-optical transfer function in HDR game mode on the Samsung S95B would always track brighter than the PQ or perceptual quantization standard, even after lowering the ST2084 setting to the minimum value of -3. Now, we're aware that many gamers will probably prefer this brighter than reference presentation, but ultimately it's going above the PQ curve, namely the standard for HDR10 content regardless of whether it's a movie or a game, which deviates from the creative intent and risks introducing more polarization, since the core concept of PQ is to establish a threshold below which polarization won't be visible. Since the Samsung S95B is not compatible with Dolby Vision, it naturally doesn't support Dolby Vision gaming from the Xbox Series X, so some games with no in-game brightness slider such as Microsoft Flight Simulator would exhibit blown-out highlights. Design-wise, the QD-OLED panel on the Samsung S95B was probably the thinnest we've seen among consumer OLEDs. Some owners have complained about the panel flexing or bending out of shape too easily, but I've had no such issues on my 55-inch retail unit, even after moving it around numerous times to free up space or for side-by-side comparisons, though be aware that I've been told that my hands are quite gentle. Otherwise, the Samsung S95B carries two unique traits of QD-OLED technology. 1. The red, green and blue subpixels are arranged in a triangle instead of the more traditional RGB stripe layout, which may lead to color fringing on high contrast edges. However, unless you're using the TV as a PC monitor up close, we don't think it's a problem for most people from a normal viewing distance. 2. Like other QD-OLED displays we've tested, the Samsung S95B suppressed reflections extremely well, but the screen would turn gray particularly when hit by direct light, due to the lack of a polarizer in the QD-OLED panel. When there's enough bright content on screen, your eyes won't be able to pick up the grayer blacks in a bright room, but bear in mind that when the TV is off, the screen may look as gray as plasma TVs of old, depending on the angle at which light hits the screen. Despite the ultra-thin panel, the Samsung S95B was able to generate relatively impressive sound, delivering sufficient bass as well as pleasant mids and highs to satisfy casual viewing. Every now and again, we notice a lip-sync delay when watching Dolby Atmos movies, but a quick rewind and resume would sort it out. The S95B features the 2022 version of Samsung's Tizen Smart TV platform, which has been made snappier and more responsive by firmware update 12.11. It's still another layer to get through to the picture settings using the smart remote though, so if you are not based in Europe where Samsung S95Bs ship with a second remote, you can buy a traditional remote control from eBay or Amazon, which will let you bypass Tizen and access the picture menu directly. To sum up, the S95B is a stunning 4K OLED debut from Samsung, delivering class-leading screen uniformity, viewing angles, and color luminance on top of 0 candelas per square meter blacks and insanely high contrast, courtesy of a new self-emissive display technology. Gamers will also appreciate the Samsung S95B's super low input lag and 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, not to mention OLED's near instantaneous pixel response time and excellent picture quality which doesn't degrade in game mode, although those who prefer an accurate HDR game mode may have to look elsewhere. Areas which could be improved include handling of low bitrate content and motion processing. But these shortcomings don't stop the Samsung S95B from being one of the best TVs you can buy in 2022 in terms of picture quality, and so it deservedly earns our highly recommended award. Now, if you have bought the Samsung S95B, or indeed any other television, there's a sneaky setting buried in the user menu that actually worsens the picture quality. To find out what the setting is and how to disable it, please watch my instruction video by clicking here.